And it's now my pleasure to hand this meeting over to our Chair of the Day, Past President Robert Fisher, to further introduce our guest speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, President Adrian. Did you know we are registered as one of just 8 peace builder clubs in Australia? Well, as you've heard already, February is our Peace and Conflict Resolution Month, when we shine a light on one of Rotary's 7 areas of focus, namely peace building and conflict prevention. So it's extremely important for us and appropriate for us to have such a distinguished speaker as Ciaran O'Toole to speak on the topic climate change and conflict risks. Conciliation Resources is an international organization committed to stopping violent conflict and creating more peaceful solutions. And Ciaran is a member of their executive management team. He heads up the Southeast Asia and Pacific program, covering their work in the Philippines, PNG, and indeed right across the Pacific region. Ciaran commenced working for Conciliation Resources in 2010, when he headed up the organization's efforts to support the 2012 Fiji Constitution development process. Prior to joining Conciliation Resources, Ciaran worked in the private sector in senior people and program management positions in the Middle East and Australia. He holds a Master's in International Development and various other topics I was hearing earlier from RMIT University. Members and guests, it gives me great pleasure to give you Ciaran O'Toole.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you all for the invite. It's a real pleasure to come here today to talk about our work. I just hope, I was just explaining before that there's quite a lot of jargon in our work, as all of you have jargon in your work. So I don't know if there's a jargon sign, but if you want me to slow down, if you want me to hold on, what are you talking about, please feel free to do so. The focus of the conversation, or what I'm going to talk about, is climate change and conflict. And the focus of what I'm going to talk about is, is on climate change and conflict risks. And I'm really specifically going to look at the Pacific region, more specifically Melanesia and what you would know as Melanesia, so sort of from Fiji through to Papua New Guinea or West Papua. What I'll do to start with is just explain who we are, Conciliation Resources, and also explain what an international peace-building NGO like ourselves does. To picture what we do, it's quite broad, and it's applied differently in every different context. So I broke it down into 3 parts, and the first one, working with peace-building partners, is probably the core of our work. It is most of our work. It's 70% of our work. But of course, it changes with each context and the needs of each context. And that is really supporting and working with individuals, organizations, governments, but mostly civil society organizations in contexts affected by conflict, and primarily working at a community level. So supporting communities to be able to manage conflict, to analyze conflict. It's really core to enabling societies to move forward, in particular after conflict. Other work we do very quickly is more the direct type of work that we do. This is us directly working on key drivers of conflict, and it varies a lot. And what we're sort of known pretty well for is what we call comparative learning. These sort of learnings that we bring to context. And then the final one, mediation support, is more a reference to peace processes, so peace negotiations that you may be familiar with. And a lot of the time what we get involved is behind the scenes, sort of enabling both sides to think through options, back channeling, this, I think what was mentioned before, involvement in even constitution development, so providing options for the way forward. So you can see the work that we do is very diverse, and it includes a lot of analysis a lot of work at community right up to political level. And if later on I can give examples of specific contexts where we work right through those levels. So honing in on what I'm talking about today, so forget about all of that. What I'm going to talk about is focusing on the conflict risks from climate change in the Pacific region. Stepping back a little bit, it's sensible for me to just have a little discussion around land and resources in the Pacific. Some of you may be familiar with how it works in the Pacific, but it is sizably different to Australia or most other industrialized parts of the world. Land and resources are communally owned. They're typically owned by small groups, villages, communities, and it's land and resources are communally owned, so owned by everybody. But some of the problems with that, or some of the issues, is there's not necessarily clear boundaries, not necessarily clear who has access to what resources, and these things are negotiated, and tension between communities is really the standard practice in sorting out who has access to what in the Pacific region, in a sense. Now that's a broad general statement, is different in different countries. Like Fiji is much more structured. Vanuatu has a level of structure, but in particular, societies that have been affected by conflict, Solomon Islands and parts of Papua New Guinea, you find that there is this lack of clarity on boundaries, and layered on top of that, lack of clarity at times on governance. Like, what is the authority within these communities? You have chiefs and headmen, and sometimes it can be, from an outsider point of view, very hard to work out who actually makes decisions, how decisions are made. Good example, Bougainville. Post-conflict and conflict-affected context, it's a matrilineal society. So land and resources are actually handed down through the female line within the community, but decisions are made by groups of men or individuals. So it's really complex. Within all of those societies, and this is something also to say, what I'm going to talk about today is like it's doom, right? These are the risks, but that's what I'm talking about. Reality is, within the Pacific, within all of these communities, there is a level of resilience. There is conflict resolution mechanisms. They exist for hundreds of years and have been developed for hundreds of years within all of these communities. And they tend to be quite different from one community to another, in particular one region to another. They're traditional, they're typically gift-giving, but also land and resources becomes the sort of device of negotiation between different communities and within communities. So think of those conflict resolution mechanisms, the governance mechanisms, unclear, structured, but also get weakened through violent conflict. So if you think of the damage that can be caused through violent conflict, Bougainville, Solomon Islands, highlands of Papua New Guinea, it weakens these bonds within communities. And not all, I'm making broad general sweeping statements. So just the very first risk, I think I have 4 of them, 4 slides to go through. Think of even land use and access to land. Climate change will degrade, reduce the land available within the Pacific over time. And this is likely to accelerate in time. So this will be quite like through salinity of land, through coastal erosion, there will be less land available. So the tensions that exist within and between communities are likely to rise. Question marks over whether some of the governance and conflict resolution mechanisms that exist within these communities will be able to adapt, will be able to deal with and manage the changes in land access to land and land usage. The second and very important one is around displacement and relocation. So again, describing reduction in land, the availability of land and resources, and the effects that this has on communities. Bringing in also natural disasters, so an increased number of weather events, as we call them, but cyclones, and the intensity and frequency of cyclones. You will have a lot more, or likely to have a lot more, displacement and relocation. you can roughly break down the types of displacement and relocation. Some of it will be quite structured, will be governments, and it's already happening, where governments are moving communities from to other pieces of land, to what seem available pieces of land. And these are government bureaucratic type processes. There tends to be limited consultation with communities when these happen, or the communities are just not familiar with bureaucratic systems. They don't quite know what they're agreeing to. And this can lead to conflict between the community, the recipient communities, and the new communities. And then, of course, the conflict resolution mechanisms, hundreds of years old, can be quite different between the communities. The other evidence, or what we're seeing, which sounds great and is great, where communities accept community. So these are agreements between community leaders. So community leaders saying, okay, my neighbouring community, come join us. But a lot of the time, these decision-making are made between headmen, two men making a decision, not necessarily with the level of consultation that you'd want within your own community. So tensions rise within the recipient community, and likewise with the community that moves in. And there's examples of these now happening in the Pacific. And these are some of the types of communities that our partners are working in, building their capacities to be able to manage the complex issues that arise. The third, and probably the most important type of dislocation will be, and has been happening, is what you might call unstructured or informal movement. So that's in particular people, families, young people in particular, moving into informal settlements in urban centres. So Honiara, Fiji, PNG. And these, think again of the governance and conflict resolution mechanisms. These are families, not communities. These are individuals that are moving away from what were the authority in their lives, within their communities, to a place where that authority doesn't really exist, with conflict resolution mechanisms that are different or don't exist within these informal settlements. And that leads to this, and then also arriving in where there's limited resources, underemployment, serious issues around employment, especially for young men in these informal settlements. Again, creating a sort of a reservoir of fragility, in a sense, in the urban centres. And you can see that very strongly in places like Honiara, with recent riots a few months ago, and also you can see it in Port Moresby, to a lesser degree in Suva. This one I think is self-explanatory, but just to hone into it, this is more of the temporary effects, but yet at times devastating effects that natural disasters, really talking about cyclones, the intensity of these increasing. Already you're seeing it in the Pacific, and the effects of them they have. Again, I'm coming back to that governance, conflict resolution mechanisms, where you're dealing with sort of temporary tensions, like really serious tensions around losing your house, your property, destruction of property, and the effects this can have on what are the conflict resolution and the conflict and the peace building or the peace maintenance mechanisms within communities. Of course, again, there's a bit of jargon here. With some of them, please, in questions, ask me any more details if it doesn't make sense as well. This one, perhaps we can relate to a bit more. This is around increased authoritarianism, sort of crisis management and the effects that has on state governance. I'm more talking about state governance now. So if you think of a natural disaster, the immediate reaction of the populace is when we want quick decisions, we want firm and quick decisions, and we want firm governance. Think of what happened in Victoria around COVID. The devices are states of emergency, which are the standard and legitimate devices to be able to deal with natural disasters. But what we're dealing with in the Pacific in particular, but also in the Philippines, we work also, is relatively new state structures and relatively new state institutions and a relatively new political culture around democracy and inclusion. I would use more inclusion and inclusion in decision-making. We're only talking about decades old. Also, these states are dealing with really diverse communities, geographically diverse, ethnically diverse communities. And what we're likely to see through this sort of crisis management and crisis governance, so where you've got continuous cyclones and continuous natural disasters, continuous dislocation, we're likely to see an increase in authoritarian culture of governance. So we will call it exclusive governance, so you're limited influence on decision-making, limited influence of gender influence, limited influence of minority groups being like geographically isolated, ethnic minority groups. In turn, the state can become a driver of violent conflict. The state begins to fear the other. You can have the state controlled by one group, in a sense, and reacting to challenge from other groups. So you may find secessionist movements starting to grow in reaction to an authoritarian style of government. These are a little bit theory at this stage, but you can see even from the Victorian example, not to say that the Victorian government turned into an authoritarian government, but Australia has 100 years, if not hundreds of years, of experience of inclusive governance that it can slide back into. Not necessarily the case in a lot of the places we work. So I'm coming to an end. What do we do about it? I suppose what we talk about is a number of areas that I feel the Australian government, other donors, we should be focused on, is supporting sort of like a community up approach. So I described governance, conflict resolution mechanisms, this sort of supporting those mechanisms to be able to adapt. And that's in a lot of ways what our partners do, to be able to adapt, to be able to function better. I mean, this is just a little graph of the type of thing we do, where we support communities to really map out governance in their own communities and what are the gaps. So that's sort of like, to us, that's the starting point. The other thing as well is this type of thinking needs to also be included in how other development and humanitarian INGOs work. So if you think of, at the moment, there's quite a lot of climate change mitigation, building sea walls, etc. What happens quite often is, because of this feeling of a crisis and we need to do it fast, it can actually cause problems and impinge on the governance of those communities, okay? And create competition between communities, who has a seawall and not. So it can actually fuel some of the tensions between and within communities. So this is about, what we always advocate is doing really deep conflict analysis before you even step into a community and work in a community. The other thing, which is more programming, more to do with my world, is you need to be adaptive in what you do, and we would say the same to others. There's no one size fits all. Every community is different. Climate change will affect communities in different ways, will affect urban centres different to rural. So we need to be, and this will change. So there's no what we call linear approach to this. You do this and then you do this and you take an example from elsewhere. You need to do the constant analysis and change as needed. And then the other part of it, and this relates mostly to the national government, what I described as the crisis management form of government, is supporting civil society and media. Within the Pacific, there's a growing civil society, pursuing human rights, pursuing governance issues within their countries, is supporting them, and also media. If you think of some of the greatest tools to avoid, I would say, more than a challenge, authoritarian forms of governance, is that type of questioning, is that type of, I suppose, culture of accountability, transparency, accountability. Yeah, I just wanted just one more slide to say, we are Conciliation Resources, but in actual fact, these are the groups that actually do the work, in a sense. And sometimes I think, here I am, nice restaurant, giving this talk, but these are the people in Fiji, in particular, these are all the partners in Fiji, that work within the communities, do the hard work. And these are the groups that we support and work with. So, I mean, if you get a chance to look them up, Transcend Oceania, the Pacific Centre for Peace Building, and the Toda Peace Institute is actually more of a global organization that focuses on this area. And I think that's it. Thank you. That's my detail, well, my email address. Jump on that website. I'm sure Nesta would also recommend to look at our website. Check us out. There's a lot of good resources on the peace building field. I think the other thing that Conciliation Resources does quite well is tries to take learnings from peace building and peace processes and share them among their field, but also more broadly. And we're always looking for funding. If you know somebody, if you have deep pockets or know people with deep pockets, send them my direction.
Thank you very much, Ciaran. I think we've got loads of time for questions. I hope there are lots of them out there, hands going up everywhere. Please wait for the microphone and give Ciaran your name before you ask your question. Sue.
Sue McCarthy. Thank you. That was very interesting, with all those layers of complexity. But being an old banker, I'd like to know who funds you. Where does the money come from?
We're funded primarily by governments, so we get some funding from the Australian government. So the program that I run has about 15 different donors, like everything, like German government, EU, Sweden, Australian government. The work that we do on climate change is primarily MFAT, which is the New Zealand government. We have a loose policy. It depends on where we're working. So if we're working in particular in a sensitive political environment, so Bougainville is the best example. So in Bougainville, we don't have any Australian funding, partially because there is the perceptions of them. We have had Australian funding, but the perceptions of Australia within that environment, that because we have to play or always attempt to be perceived as impartial. We can't do our job unless we're perceived as that. So what we tend to have is, so in Bougainville we have 3 different donors. So we would, so in other words, there's not the perception that we're beholden to any government, that we have a number of donors. So that's what we tend to do. But really funding primarily comes from governments. We also, as an organization, get funding from foundations, individuals. I mean, if you jump on our website, you'll see there's a donate section. As I say, be correct. Well, that's the type of funding in a lot of ways we really want, is that type of core funding, which is very difficult for us to get. I think there was another.
Bruce Davidson. Terrific presentation. You've covered a lot of ground. It's a very complex problem. So complex that I'm just a little bit overwhelmed, to tell you the truth. And I wondered what you might say if we tried to achieve something in correcting things there, maybe in one place, what Australia could do with one initiative to do something that would improve things.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, the solutions to these problems are long-term. There's no real immediate solution. Like, there's not like an instant investment necessarily. I think what Australia, stepping back a bit, I think over the last years, what we've seen, for example, there was a conflict and fragility team within DFAT in Australia, in Canberra. And this is the team we related to. You know, we could talk the same language. I know you experienced some of my jargon there, conflict mechanisms, etc. But they understood what we talked about. And when we talked about long-term solutions, investing in peace-building actors who are working in communities, investment in analysis in this area, that team has been folded. They're one of the only countries in the G20 even that doesn't have a conflict-focused part of its foreign affairs. So the one thing Australia could do is the very starting point, immediate, which is maybe part of what you're asking, is to reform a team like that. We struggle to engage with the Australian government in the conversation around these things because they don't necessarily have the language. And it's been a long process of change within DFAT, we've noticed. And even the funding, as I said, we have very little funding from Australia. We have an office here. We have made a commitment to setting up in Australia, registering in Australia. We have staff in Australia. We get very little funding from Australia. It's just a very hard sell. So I suppose it's to a shift parallel. Security is important. You know, natural disasters, it does need intervention. It needs security, and it needs to build up, you know, security, policing, etc. in these states. But parallel to that, there's a need to understand and support peace-building work. In particular, actors in these individuals, governments that are working on these issues.
Hi, Ciaran. Rob McGuirk. Thanks for your talk. During the mid-2000s, I worked with the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the sort of things that you're doing seem to me similar to what they're doing. But I notice in our region, we don't have such an organisation, but we do have the Pacific Island Forum. Are you working with them or ASEAN in terms of a government-based organisation through the regions?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say we work directly with the forum. I think there's a lot of, so you've got, like, for example, the UNDP, you've got the PIFS, the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, you've got the Melanesian Spearhead Group. So I suppose we do our own work. There's a lot of what I would call sort of more coordination and sharing, you know. So what are you doing? Okay, well, we're doing this, making sure that we're not duplicating. That's the type of, but we don't actually, I suppose we don't partner with the forum, if you like. The forum's mandate is to work with governments. It doesn't work necessarily with civil society. It doesn't necessarily work outside of the government structures. It does a little bit, but primarily it's focused on government. We primarily work with civil society, but also at different stages with government.
I think we have time for one more quick question, and then we'll have to wrap up.
This one you mentioned about the climate change mitigation issues including seawater. What else is happening in terms of climate change mitigation? Deforestation, what else can be done to make the lives of these people in those communities much more bearable and really nice?
Yeah, look, I think there is quite a bit. I mean, seawalls is probably the best example. The thing is, you can't build a wall around atolls necessarily. You can't just, you know, hem in whole islands. I think seawalls are the best example. When it comes to forestry, there are forestry initiatives, in particular around CO2 offset type of work going on in the Solomon Islands, for example. But that doesn't necessarily link into the community itself and the issues that I talked about. I think what was beginning to happen, you know, 'cause I'm not a infrastructure person. I would more think about, you know, societal change and the effects of these things on societal change. We are seeing efforts to, I suppose, codify, regularize displacement and relocation. What I mean by that is sort of like setting up processes that governments should follow to relocate populations, because there's going to be a lot of that happening. And we're involved somewhat with that, with organizations that think through what is the best practice for relocating communities. So we always come with this sort of conflict lens, as we call it, conflict sensitivity lens. You know, how will this affect potential violent conflict, you know, protect against violent conflict emerging, and what are the things that need to happen? Don't quite answer your question because I don't know too much about what's happening in infrastructure.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Ciaran. I sense that you just scratched the surface of this topic, and I also sense from the variety of questions that a lot of people in this room are really deeply concerned about what goes on in the wider Asia-Pacific region. And indeed, there are a number of great projects that Rotary is involved in that part of the world, which we can talk about separately. So thank you very much indeed for your time and for your talk. And we have here a token gift, which is a pair of socks associated with the upcoming convention you've heard about. And I believe there's also a Rotary coin in there celebrating 100 years of Rotary, probably of value in about 100 years' time. So thank you very much.